give an introductory note. So I'll just do that. I hope they will join us in the meanwhile. So I'm really honored to be here, and thank you so much for asking me to present a brief introduction note for this webinar on Hadith criticism and Hadith studies at large. And I'm also so happy that we have some giants in the field of Hadith studies today with us. And one of them is my teacher. Two of them are my teachers. So I'm just gonna go along. Okay. So I'm sorry for the bizarre starting, but let's hope it will be okay soon. The term hadith is often used in a broader sense to mean the body of eyewitness accounts about the sunnah of the Prophet, his behavior and his practices. The 21st verse in Surah Al-Ahzab, you have a good example in the Messenger of God. لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ shows us how important is Prophet Muhammad's legacy for Muslims. Jonathan Brown rightly named his book on Hadith The Legacy of Muhammad. This idea that Prophet's life is helpful for understanding and interpreting Quranic directives and for modeling one's ideal life is what essentially encourages the whole enterprise of Hadith, which is thus the second form of textual authority in Islam. This is also why many of legal and theological traditions are not directly derived from Quran, but rather developed in the light of Hadith traditions. While it primarily reports the sayings, deeds, or tacit approvals from the Messenger of God, a particular Hadith report consists of two parts, Matan and Isnad, the narrative of the actual event and the list of transmitters of this Hadith respectively. The latter, which is Isnad, has traditionally been subject to more scrutiny and analysis than the Matan. As the legacy of Prophet Muhammad was so important for Muslim life, great care and enormous efforts have been taken to ensure the reliability of those who transmitted the Hadith and thereby the credibility of Prophet's legacy. The questions at stake here were concerning the contemporaneity of the transmitters, like whether two subsequent transmitters in the chain were of the same period and able to meet each other, and the questions of their integrity, adala, and honesty, and so on and so forth. As a result of this, vast biographical texts on transmitters were also emerged in the Islamic history, starting with the Ilmul Hadith scholars, whose main concerns were the forgery and inauthenticity of certain hadith. Many groups and scholars, both Western and Orientalist and non-Western scholars, the likes of Godziher and Joseph Schaft, have contributed to what is commonly known as the field of hadith criticism over time. Unfortunately, some of the Muslim modernists have also totally negated the role of hadith in Muslim legal reasoning and other areas. When Imam Shafi'i asserted the equal relevance of hadith in legal reasoning, first among those, the Ahlul Hadith and Murtazilites were to come first, questioning the use and authenticity of hadith. In addition, 3 centuries following the death of Prophet Muhammad witnessed the proliferation of Hadith collections. Some of these collections were grouped around the questions of law and rituals. Some other Hadith collections were focused on the companions who transmitted these Hadiths or these multitude of Hadiths, while another codification also which are also taken place later, combined both the subject matter and sources of transmission as their thematics. Significantly, 6 main canonical Hadith collections, also known popularly as As-Sihah Sitta, emerged in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Sahih of Muhammad bin Ismail al-Bukhari, the Sahih of Muslim ibn Hajjaj al-Naisaburi, the Sunan of Abu Dawud al-Sijistani, the Sahih of Ahmad al-Nasa'i, the Jami of Muhammad bin Isa al-Tirmizi, and the Sunan of Muhammad bin Yazid bin Majah. Later on, large commentaries and also some small special collections such as Arba'unas, the famous one being of Imam An-Nawawi, and critical studies were produced in the Muslim world. Many scholars have noted that the earlier enterprise of Hadith study and collection was driven by spiritual concerns rather than by legal or any other concerns. As those people in the first few centuries were making pious inquiries into the ideal conduct of Prophet Muhammad's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Over time, Hadith study became a reference tool for the legal scholars in their legal reasoning and for many other pursuits and disciplines. Particular orientations of the scholars who studied Hadith from different perspectives were thus helpful in exploring new meanings and understandings that could be derived from Hadith. I'm going to stop here by quoting this widely circulated saying by the famous muhaddith from Kufa, who once spoke to the famous jurist Imam Abu Hanifa, Antumul Atibba wa nahnu sayadila. You, the jurists, are the medical practitioners, and we are pharmacists who take care of the medicine, and you are the people who induct legal norms and principles from the body of Hadith. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here, and if the host is ready to come along, I'll let them speak. Otherwise, I'll just move on to welcome the inaugurator, who's Dr. Abdul Hakim Azhari. Let me just see if they are online.
Thank you, Ashraf. Okay, sorry for the interruption. We had little bit technical issues. That's why we were lagged for some minutes. So now we will have our inaugural address by Dr. Abdul Hakim Azhari, Director of Jamia Madinatul Noor, Kerala. Ustad, please. Ustad, are you here? Okay, I think Ustad is here, but couldn't get him. Is his mic unmute?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, you can start inshallah.
Okay.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. It's my privilege to be here in Riwaya Hadith webinar hosted by the Department of Hadith Studies at Jamia Madinatul Noor on the relevant topic, Hadith criticism, analyzing the methodologies in Sunnah comprehension. We are honored here with the best faculties who will give lectures in our program and will ignite good discussion on the topic. Prophetic traditions or Hadith are the second most important source of Islamic law. Hence, they are given great significance among varied disciplines in Islamic scientific tradition. However, the authentication of Hadith has been a biggest challenge right from the early centuries of Islam. Due to many reasons, like the proliferation of Hadith in 2nd century and the later quantification along with the act of forgery created by many problems, and these issues necessitated the analysis of each hadith to ensure whether they come from Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam or not. This authenticity question has attracted the attention of both the Muslim specialists in the early classical period as well as that of Western scholars since the mid-19th century. Early Muslim traditionalists has developed a powerful science known as Usul al-Hadith with the aim of sifting the fake and unreliable hadith from the genuine ones. Although this science can be traced back to Ash-Shafi'i, scholars from subsequent eras had also contributed to this to preserve hadith as a source of law. Even though there are many works of scholars in that respect, hadiths have never been free from controversy and criticism. We could see that discussions and debates questioning the authenticity and reliability of hadith entered into a new phase with the beginning of Western analysis of hadith. By the second half of 19th century, Western scholars started critically evaluating hadith themselves in terms of its matan and sanad in order to check their origin, credibility, and the claim of Muslim traditionalists that hadith could be traced back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some Western scholars attempted to cast doubt on the integrity of hadith as a corpus of law to the extent that some tend to call for its complete rejection. It is at most ignominy that several Muslim scholars began to view hadith with skepticism by being influenced in these Western notions. Some groups, like the Quranists, called for a complete rejection of the hadith, whilst advocating the self-sufficiency of the Quran as a source of law and guidance. However, assault on hadith had been defended by various Muslim scholars itself. In the contemporary world, also, many scholars are contributing much to the rescue of hadith and to counter its critics. We could notice the methodology applied in Western and Muslim traditions, which are based on a set of pre-assumptions as a differentiating factor in the reading of Hadith between the two. Also, we could see different approaches in criticism within Muslim scholars and in the Western tradition. Understanding these methodologies and the underlying factors of the premises in each approach are highly important to preserve the Hadith corpus from distortions. Hope this webinar will open up good debates and discussions on these subjects. I appreciate the members of the Department of Hadith Studies at Jamia Medinan Dominance for organizing such a good program. Indeed, the program will throw insight into the researches of many religious scholars in Hadith. As Jamia Medinan Dominance has been organizing many events to ignite deep reflections on various subjects in Islamic studies, the webinar, as the latest among them, will also produce desirable outcomes in Hadith science. With great pleasure, I would like to inaugurate this webinar by reciting the holy verse, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum Assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you, Ustad, for inaugurating our program. Now we will have presentation of our guest speakers. Here we are honored with the presence of renowned scholars in Hadith studies, Dr. Bilal Abbas, Dr. Murtaza Khatib, Dr. Edo, and Dr. Said. Inshallah, we will have a good presentation of speakers. For the convenience of our time, we have pulled our Q&A session for the end of our program. Inshallah, we will have 20 minutes presentation of our speakers and half an hour Q&A session at the end. Now, let me invite our second guest lecturer, a speaker, Dr. Murtaza Khatib, Associate Professor of Islamic Ethics and Quran and Hadith at Ahmad bin Khalifa University, Qatar. He will be speaking on Hadith and plurality in methodologies, Matin criticism between traditionist and jurisprudence. Let me cordially invite, sir, please. So we are not audible. Are you here, sir? Okay, I think Professor is connecting.
We can't hear, sir.
attendees can type the queries and comments in the chat box. We will copy it to our presenters. Is there any issues? Sir, here his connection has lost. We shall wait for him. Regarding the presentation of our speaker, Dr. Bilal Abdul Abbas. So we have some questions. If he's not getting, we could ask it now here. Okay, we are not seeing him. Hope he will be back soon. We will have the presentation of our other speaker, Dr. Isam Edo is here. Dr. Isam Edo, senior lecturer at Department of Religious Studies at Vanderbilt University, USA. He will be speaking on Murtaza criterion of Hadith criticism. Let me cordially invite him, sir, please.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Do you hear me?
Yes, sir, we could hear.
Okay, can I share a screen?
Okay.
I'm not able to share my screen.
Let me check, sir, whether we have any technical issues, as we are using the updated version of Zoom.
Now it's good. Okay.
There might be some issues. It's okay now.
Do you see the screen? Do you see the screen?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I hope I can talk within 20 minutes. I think it's not enough to talk within 20 minutes about this complicated and very hard topic. So my presentation today about Mu'tazila criterion of Hadith criticism. So first of all, I'd like to give a background about why Mu'tazila. So Mu'tazila considers the first Islamic school in the history of Islam to give epistemological perspective on verifying prophetic reports. And from them, we can see the whole shift in the history of Islam built on verifying Hadith, and later on we can see the Hadith criticism discipline. So when we speak about Mu'tazila, do speak about one school or schools. However, so when we think about Mu'tazila, first of all, we think about their theological perspective. But here we talk about their epistemological perspective, and especially as we can see later about their perspective on certainty and reductionism. I'll talk about that later. So Mu'tazila was known for 5 theological principles: the unity of God, justice, and commanding right, forbidding wrong, and divine promise and warning. And the last one is the rank between 2 ranks. But however, there are 2 principles of these 5 very significant. And we can, these 2 principles, the Tawheed and Al-Adl. So Tawheed, the unity of God, and Al-Adl, the divine justice. So, but which one is the core of I'tizal, the divine justice or divine unity? So, however, in the Kutub al-Tabaqat, the literature of Tabaqat, we can see that Mu'tazila depicted or labeled as Ahl al-Adl wa Tawheed, but later, especially in the 4th and 5th Islamic century, and especially by Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, who penned a very important work, Fadl al-I'tizal, give this label to Mu'tazila al-Adliyun. Al-Adliyun, that means the people of Adl. So here we can see the main isnad provided by Ibn al-Murtaza in his Tabaqat al-Mu'tazila. So this is the main isnad started by Ali bin Abi Talib from Prophet's family by Al-Itra, and end with Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. So around 4 Islamic centuries. So, the black color represents the early Mu'tazila till Abu al-Huzayl al-Allaf, who died in 235 Islamic year, and then started with literature and works by Abu Yaqub al-Shahham, and there's the late era, so the early era from Ali bin Abi Talib till Abu al-Huzayl al-Allaf, and then from Abu Yaqub al-Shahham till Al-Qadi Abd al-Jabbar. So we notice a couple of things in this main isnad. So like when we mention I'tizal, mostly we think about many important figures, among them Al-Jahiz and Al-Nazam. So however, in this main isnad, we don't see Al-Nazam and we don't see Al-Jahiz. So, but we see other figures, and also we don't see the Baghdadi school, as I'll talk later. So the absence of Al-Jahiz al-Nizam and the absence of Baghdadi school in the late era. So from Abu Yaqub al-Shahham to Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, we don't see anyone from Baghdadi school in Mu'tazila. So as I said, the isnad, the range of this isnad is around 400 years. This isnad, mapping out the whole isnad, starting from Wasil bin Ata and Umayr bin Ubaid al-Basri, the main figures who initiate I'tizal in the history of Islam, and ends with here like 4th Islamic century, and here till 6th Islamic century. So the black color represents the early Mu'tazila, and the red one represents Baghdadi school, and the pink one, I'm sorry, not pink, purple one, presents Basri school, and started the Basri school started with Abu Ali al-Jubba'i, and the Baghdadi school started with Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi. So how we can approach Mu'tazila perspective in terms of Hadith criticism? So mostly when we discuss this topic in Sunni literature, we focus on Sunni works in early stage and then in late stage. So in early stage, we can see two important figures. The first one, Shafi'i ibn Qutayba, and in late era, we can witness works by Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi and all works post Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi and then Ibn Hajar. In late era, especially in the second Islamic century, we witness two important works labeled as Ta'wil Mukhtalaf al-Hadith. So if we read deeply these books, Ta'wil Mukhtalaf al-Hadith, mostly we can see a hidden reference to Kitab al-Tahrish by Dirar bin Amr. So Dirar bin Amr perspective on Hadith in his introduction to his book al-Tahrish, and then during the book saying this important statement that Muslim in that era witnessed a liquidity in Hadith literature and a contradiction. And to solve this issue, the liquidity and contradiction, so to solve this issue is just to abandon Isnad authority and to rely on other authorities like Sunnah or Aql, reasoning, or Kitab, or Ijma', or all of these authorities and resources outside of Isnad. So however, Shafi'i and Ibn Qutayba found that the Sunni literature is a very big literature and also messy, but they consider the other group, especially Mu'tazilite, as a lazy group. So they don't have time, or maybe they don't believe in this treasure. So Shafi'i and Ibn Qutayba thinking we need to explore this treasure, and we need to build epistemological approach to find which isnad or which hadith is verified and not verified. And then Shafi'i bent two important works. The first one, Al-Risala, which is, we can see, let me here quote Aaron Zeiso in his book, The Economy of Certainty, when he talked about the two types of authority, the two types of authentications. The first one, authentication in theory, and the second one, authentication in use. So however, Shafi'i's book, Al-Risala, considered as a book for authenticity in theory. So Shafi'i provided in this book a very important statements discussing and arguing with the idea of or establishing the concept of hujjah. So the same term used, as we can see later, by Wasit ibn Ata and Dirar bin Amr. So then in the second Islamic century, the whole discussion was about hujjah, not about sahih or not about any term. Hujjah was the main important technical terms, not tawatur and not hadith, or so hujjah is the main concept discussed that time. So this Risala is a theoretical work by Shafi'i. The second work by Shafi'i and Ibn Qutayba, Ta'wil Mukhtalaf al-Hadith, where they provide complicated and sophisticated methodology to say we can explore and we can classify hadith, and we can know which one is weak and which one is sound. So this is what we can witness in the early era, focusing on like two types of works, theory and usage. But in later era, al-Mutaakhirun, especially by Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi in his old books, Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi gave a very important definition for Sahih, says that the hadith Sahih should be narrated by two. And through another two, so on to the companions of Prophet. So two camps after Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi received his this statement. The camp said this definition looks like Mu'tazilite methodology, Mu'tazilite approach, because some Mu'tazilite in the early era stipulated 2 narrators to verify any hadith. But the majority of Sunni scholars said, no, this is not a stipulation for hadith, but a stipulation to how we rank the narrators. So then we don't stipulate 2 narrators in each hadith, but we stipulate here 2 narrators from each narrator in general, not in hadith. So, however, so we can see 2 camps and many literature written on this topic. But Ibn Hajar, in his book Nuzhat al-Nazar, is a very important book and taught in schools and very precise and small. So in this like 100 pages, we can see 3 pages just talking about al-Jubba'i approach on Hadith Sahih, and Ibn Hajar mentions that al-Jubba'i stipulated 2 narrators for Hadith to be accepted. And he said, Ibn Hajar, that received by scholars that as Mu'tazilite epistemological perspective. So, however, so this is what we can see in Sunni literature, but that's not what we can see in Mu'tazilite school on Hadith. So, in Mu'tazilite school on Hadith, we can witness 3 schools based on chronological orders. The first one early, late, and then Abu al-Husayn al-Basri. In early, 3 important figures, al-Jahiz and al-Allaf and al-Khayyat. As I said, al-Jahiz is omitted from the main isnad based on Ibn al-Murtada Tabaqat, and al-Khayyat also omitted. Al-Allaf is mentioned as the borderline between early and late, or by al-Allaf, the early era finished. So, however, each one of these provided stipulations and standard to verify hadith. So, like Al-Allaf, he based on Mu'tazilite literature, he asked for 20 narrators for any hadith to be accepted, 20 narrators in each tabaqa. So Al-Khayyat provided non-report-based support for any hadith. So he does not accept Khabar al-Wahid, but instead, rather, he gave the authority to Quran and Ijma' and Sunnah Ma'rufa. So there is no any authority for Isnad, but the authority for Quran and Sunnah Ma'rufa, the non-Sunnah and Ijma' consensus. And Al-Jahiz, on other side, he said, in order to accept any hadith, any Khabar Wahid, we need 2 narrators. So this in the early era. In late era, when we see the division between Baghdadi and Basri, so in Basri school started with Al-Jubba'i, as we can see the isnad, the main isnad started with Al-Jubba'i and end with Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. So for Al-Jubba'i, isnad itself is not an evidence and does not have any independent authority. So how we know any hadith verified or accepted? He put 3 ways to verify any hadith. The first one, Quran, and the second one, Ijma', and the third one, Aql. So reasoning, consensus, and Quran. Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, he said the reports 2 types. The first one based on Amal, legal issues, and the second one based on religions, like based on deen. And he said, Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, any khabar based on Amal, legal issues, accepted. And any khabar based on deen, any khabar wahid based on deen, not accepted. But however, for Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, if the khabar for amal or for deen, not accepted if this khabar contradicts with Quran and absolute sunnah. So if this khabar contradicts with Quran or absolute sunnah. And however, Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar also provided us with 4 resources outside of Isnad. The first one, Al-Quran, and the second one, Al-Ijma' Al-Qati, is absolute consensus, and then also absolute sunnah, Adillatu Sunnah Al-Qati'a, and also أدلة العقل التي لا تحتمل التأويل. So that means evidences or rational or reasoning evidence that there is no room for interpretation, a clear reasoning. So this for Basri school. For Baghdadi school, Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi considers the most important work and the most important figure in terms of hadith criticism. Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi wrote his book قبول الأخبار ومعرفة الرجال. In his introduction, there are 2 pages, the most important 2 pages we need to read deeply to discover the Mu'tazila approach. And then in the whole book, al-Baghdadi provide us with many reports through Isnad. So we can witness with al-Balkhi, the first book written through Isnad to criticize Isnad. So this, like using the same weapons, the same tools, the same instrument used by Hadith, but to criticize Hadith, but not to give any authority to Isnad. But however, the introduction is very important, not the book itself, because as we can see, and we have 2 texts from al-Balkhi to focus on and to read, and he did not give any authority to Khabar al-Wahid as independent resource or independent evidence, but he gave the authority to all resources out of Isnad, out of report evidence. With Abu al-Husayn al-Basri, and especially in his book Al-Mu'tamad, we can witness a refutation to all Mu'tazila. Abu al-Husayn al-Basri merged with other Kalami, Ash'arites, and Sunni thought, Sunni perspective, and accepted Khabar al-Wahid. And in his book, we witness that there is many statements to criticize Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar, Al-Jubba'i, and others. And he gave us evidence that we need to rely on Khabar al-Wahid. So then with Abu al-Husayn al-Basri, we can witness the Mu'tazilite theory on Hadith is dissolved and disappear. And then, but Mu'tazilite remain with the Zaydi legacy. So that's why we witness At-Tabaqat by Ibn al-Murtaza later. So Ibn al-Murtaza is a Zaydi, belonged to Zaydi school. And he wrote this book, Tabaqat al-Mu'tazila, and remain, and he continues the legacy of I'tizal. So, however, but we can witness also with this Zaydi literature, Zaydi legacy of I'tizal, we can witness a very important shift from Mu'tazilite approach towards Hadith or towards Sunni approach. So this a statement by Wasil ibn Ata, cited by Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar in his book Fadl al-I'tizal. Wasil ibn Ata said كل خبر لا يمكن فيه التواطؤ والتراسل والاتفاق على غير التواطؤ فهو حجة. الحق لا يعرف إلا بكتاب الله الذي لا يحتمل التأويل وبخبر جاء مجيء الحجة وبعقل سليم. So then, if in order to know any khabar is verified, we need to criticize this khabar based on Kitabullah and based on khabar that came as authoritative report, and also aql salim, absolute or sound reasoning. And the technical terms here provided by Wasil ibn Ata al-Hujja, as I said, became a very important technical term in the second Islamic century. And that's why we see in a Shafi'i book, Al-Risala, he refutes and he engaged in the discussion about Hujjah, the definition of Hujjah. So then we can see 2 definitions on Hujjah in the second century. Here, what we can see, what we can see by Wasil ibn Ata when he gives the definition of Hujjah, this is the definition. كل خبر لا يمكن فيه التواطؤ. There is no collusion, there is no corresponding between narrators, and no hidden agreement between narrators to narrate this hadith. So this al-khabar al-hujjah based on Wasil. But based on the Shafi'i, he shifted and he moved al-hujjah from this a definition to another definition, becoming later a definition for Hadith Sahih by Al-Hafiz ibn Salah. So the second text by Abu al-Qasim al-Balkhi, he gave a very epistemological perspective how we can approach narrators. He said, تقديم سوء الظن. So first we need to put or to make سوء الظن, the bad presumption, as a priority to criticize narrators. And then he said 5 evidences or 5 resources can tell us which khabar is verified or not verified. Kitabullah, Sunnatu Rasulullah al-Mujma' alayha, that means the Sunnah that's agreed upon by Muslims, and then Ijma' al-Ummah, consensus, and then Amal al-Sadr al-Awwal, the praxis of the first generation, and al-Aql, the reasoning. But all of these, any report or any statement coming or deriving from all of these resources, if contradict the 2 major principles, at-Tawheed, the divine unity, and the divine justice, then this statement would be rejected. So why? Because for al-Balkhi and others, all statements or religious statements should conform and should match these 2 major principles. And the message and the role of prophets just to verify and to confirm these 2 major principles. So we don't accept any khabar, even though mutawatir or Quran, if contradict with these 2 principles. So then if we see any khabar in like any Quranic text, this Quranic text should be interpreted, and so then they found a room for interpretation. So the second one here, al-Balkhi, in his introduction, giving us 3 types of issues. The first one, usul al-kalam al-mujtama' alayha, that means the major foundations, the major theological foundation. He said, we cannot accept any khabar but al-akhbar al-mutawatira. And the second category, al-amr al-aam, the public affairs. So we don't accept as Mu'tazilite any khabar but khabar al-jama'a, the report by the society or the group, and amal al-ummah, the praxis and the action of nation. But then khabar al-ithnain wa thalatha is accepted. So any khabar narrated by 2 or 3 accepted, but only in furu', only in positive law, not in not in theological issues. And this accepted based on dhan, not based on yaqeen, not based on certainty. So here in this chart, we can see the main important figures in the Mu'tazila history: Al-Allaf, Al-Khayyat, Al-Jahiz, Al-Jubba'i, Al-Balkhi, and Abdul Jabbar. And here we, based on my readings, I found around 10 technical terms used by them, or 10 technical issues used by them to criticize the authority of Isnad, and just to give the authority to something not based on Isnad, but based on praxis, based on tradition, based on Sunnah, based on here like non-Sunnah or absolute Sunnah, certain Sunnah, or reasoning, or Aql Salim, Aql La Yahtamilu Ta'wil. And all of them require certainty. So all of them require certainty. And from them, that's why I found, so Mu'tazila is very important based on epistemological approach, because the whole discipline generated from their statement in the 2nd Islamic century and so on. But all of these discussions disappeared in the late era. But we can see this discussion in early period in Ibn Qutaybah and Shafi'i and other books. But just one thing remained in the Sunni literature is the number of narrators. So the number of narrators, this one thing that remained in Sunni literature when they describe or argue with Mu'tazilite. So then we can see at Nuzhat al-Nazar, Ibn Hajar mentioned Al-Jubba'i, and he said Al-Jubba'i stipulated 2 narrators for any report to be accepted. So, however, here you can maybe rely on this chart and maybe later to see, or you can analyze this chart based on many details. So all of them require Quran as an evidence, tawatur and ijma'. All of them reject Khabar al-Wahid, except al-Balkhi and Abdul Jabbar. They were restricted towards Khabar al-Wahid. So al-Balkhi, as we see, okay, accept Khabar al-Wahid in furu', positive law in fiqh, but also this Khabar should be narrated by two or not one. So then, like same as we can see the definition of al-Hadith al-Aziz in the late era. And Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar also put some restrictions on Khabar al-Wahid and did not accept Khabar al-Wahid if this also Khabar contradict with Quran and Sunnah Qati'a, absolute Sunnah. So however, we can say Khabar al-Wahid is not accepted alone, and here or as an independent resource. So, but Khabar al-Wahid in belief, all of them said we don't accept this Khabar al-Wahid in belief, but these two also accept, but based on some limitations and restrictions. So, do I have time, Sidi Muhammad?
We are a little bit running out of time. Shall we?
So how many minutes can you give me just to finish the last slide?
Okay, sir. Within 3 minutes, if possible.
Inshallah, inshallah. So just to summarize epistemological perspective, as I said, based on Aaron Zeiss in his book, The Economy of Certainty, we can see two types of authenticity in use and authenticity in theory. So based on authenticity in use, we can see Al-Mu'tazila rejected Khabar al-Wahid, rejected the authority of Isnad. And same in theory, both of them we can see, but in use we can see Mu'tazilite, as we will see here. So they accept akhbar that confirm their doctrines and reject any traditions contradict with their doctrines. So based on epistemology, we can see two phenomena. The first one, all Mu'tazila require certainty, so there is no any room for presumption or dhan. And the second one, reductionism. And reductionism is a term used by the scholars of epistemology of testimony, and telling us that these people does not rely or giving any authority for any report. So they don't see any tradition or any report as an independent resource to establish principles. So based on what the criterion of it is, that the first one, they rejecting Khabar al-Wahid and accepting tawatur. But if this tawatur, whether Quran or Khabar, contradict with their principles, then would be interpreted. And the third criterion is to limit the text. So if you reject Khabar al-Wahid, that means you limit the text and widen and expand the interpretation. So this gives them a very wide room to interpret text and then to maneuver via text and through text. The fourth criterion, they accept any report confirming the Mu'tazila doctrine. So then is not, when they accept any report, they don't accept based on the isnad, but based on the content. And this is what we can see here, like this khabar narrated by Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar and also Ibn al-Murtaza. They narrated this khabar, and you can see how they use isnad or how they use hadith to as authority when this hadith confirm or match their doctrine. وقد روي فيه حديث ذكره ابن يزداد بإسناده عن علي عليه السلام عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يكون في أمتي رجل يقال له واصل بن عطاء يفصل بين الحق والباطل. So we don't see this hadith in any corpus, in any collection, except in Fadl al-I'tizaz, the first time mentioned in the history of Islam by Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar in the 4th Islamic century, and this hadith becoming a very important hadith or resource to give the authority for Mu'tazila as a school or as a legal and authoritative school in the history of Islam. I'm sorry to take more than what you gave me, and I hope you found in what I talked any benefit. And walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Thank you, sir. It was a valuable presentation. However, unfortunately, we are very sorry for not being able to allot you much time for giving a comprehensive presentation, as we have very limited time. We have some questions. We can share it with you at the end, as we have to cover. We have 2 more presentations left. Thank you, sir. Now let me invite our 3rd speaker, Murtaza al-Khatib.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir, we could hear you.
Okay, good. Okay. Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Murtaza al-Khatib, Associate Professor of Islamic Ethics and Quran and Hadith Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, Qatar. He will be speaking on Hadith and plurality in methodologies, Matin criticism between traditionalist and jurisprudence. Please, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mohammed. Thanks for this invitation, and thanks for the organizers of this webinar. My talk will present a comparative analysis of the theory and practice of Hadith criticism among Hadith critics and jurists. So I will divide my talk into 4 parts. Brief introduction. I will clarify the focus and my methodology. The second part will be on the emerging discipline of Hadith criticism, and the third one will be on the disciplinary assumptions, methods, and concerns. And the last one will be on criteria for method criticism among both groups. As for the introduction, so numerous differences evident in the literature of Mustalah al-Hadith and Usul al-Fiqh demonstrate methodological differences on Hadith criticism, whether between muhaddithin and themselves, or between them and usuliyin, namely in how each analyzed and criticized the chain of transmission and the text of traditions. The 2 methods are evident in numerous works, including those of Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Hazimi, Ali ibn Muhammad ibn al-Qattan, and many other later scholars of Hadith who wrote about Mustalah al-Hadith or Hadith studies. When viewed from this comparative perspective, a number of new questions concerning Hadith criticism arise. How these questions, such as how can we understand the differences on Hadith criticism between these 2 groups? In what ways did Hadith criticism differ across legal schools? To what extent did their approaches overlap? And finally, how was the practice of Hadith criticism shaped by the epistemological frameworks and overall aims of the separate disciplines of Hadith and Fiqh? Methodologically, I try to combine between chronological and synchronic analysis of Hadith criticism in these 2 disciplines. This is to trace 3 points. Number 1 is the function of Muhaddith and Usuli. Number 2 is the interaction between theory and practice. Number 3 is the overlap between different approaches based on the personality of specialists, the development of such discipline, and the debate between different specialists from different backgrounds. The plurality of methodologies of hadith criticism will be demonstrated through the existing differences in different levels, approaches, concerns, terminology, and finally the relation between theory and practice بين الممارسة والتنظير. So now let's move to the second part of my talk, the emerging discipline of hadith criticism. It is famous, it is known for all the students of hadith. I think the saying from Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, when he said that knowing the discipline of hadith is a matter of inspiration, ilham. If you said to a scholar versed in the ilal of hadith, on what basis did you say that? He will not have proof. One of it seems that Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi was interacting with some critiques, early critiques on hadith criticism as a discipline. So one of the early challenges that hadith and as a scholarly discipline faced was the lack of theoretical foundation, a problem which would put hadith criticism legitimacy as a distinct discipline into question. This challenge was spoken out by two main groups, namely Ahl al-Ra'i and Mu'tazila, as we have heard now. So now, although some of the hadith critiques, as Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj tried to demonstrate that hadith criticism was a scholarly discipline, the problem of the lack of written theoretical framework persisted. But it's legitimacy to ask the question here: why hadith critiques did not busy themselves with theorizing their critical methodology? So my answer to this question could be because they perceived ta'lil as a practice rather than theory. They regarded the science ta'lil as something mysterious, whose knowledge would require memorization and experience more than anything else. And additionally, developing a theoretical framework was not fitting with the mindset of those working in the field of hadith, as we can see clearly from the early works. However, the way that traditionists try to build up the foundation of their discipline followed different route, which consists two genres, namely the early books on al-Jarh wal-Ta'dil and Ilal al-Hadith. And the second genre is the Hadith Collections. As for the first genre, I mean the early books on al-Jarh wal-Ta'dil and Ilal al-Hadith, one cannot say that it was completely free from any theoretical aspects, although they remained always concise and condensed. Sometimes the author would write a short treatise to explain his methodology and terminology, as Abu Dawood and the Tirmidhi did. Furthermore, the early hadith critiques adopted a specific method, namely the question-answer method, in which the critic will ask his sheikh practical questions about the transmitters, the matan, and other issues related to hadith criticism as a discipline. As for the second genre, I mean the so-called hadith collections, each collection was the outcome of a long-established experience in hadith criticism according a specific method, which differ from one hadith critique to another. Although compiling such collections is inconceivable without having a theoretical framework in mind, such a framework was not expressed in these collections. So theorization of hadith criticism was not properly crystallized until the 4th and 10th century, through the contributions of Al-Rama Hormuzi and Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, then to be extended by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, Ibn Salah, and Ibn Hajar, as you know. By this time, we started to have the term sciences of hadith, where ta'lil will be one of these sciences. These scholars, I mean hadith scholars, embarked upon the process of theorization depending on the writings of the early hadith critics, how they judged the authenticity of certain reports and on their methodologies in the hadith collections. These scholars disagreed with each other on how this theorization should be made, and they envisaged some theoretical foundations based on their understanding of the writings of the early critics. However, the interplay of methods between traditionalists and jurists took place, but the majority of the contemporary studies which addressed the question method criticism did not capture this difference between the critiques who practiced hadith criticism in the time of the transmission and the hadith scholars who engaged in theorization. So ta'lil is a central, in my opinion, is a central concept to highlight the existing of two methods of hadith criticism. Now let's move to the third part of my talk: disciplinary assumptions, methods, and concerns. Before examining the specific methods employed by hadith critics and jurists in hadith criticism, it is necessary to understand the overall disciplinary frameworks within which these methods were elaborated. As for hadith critiques, hadith criticism is essentially a two-tiered process. First, they seek to locate hadiths along a spectrum authenticity or reliability, ranging from sahih to mawdu' with varying degrees of acceptability, husn, and weakness, da'f, in between. This classification is based in the first instance on isnad analysis, which is concerned chiefly with the reliability of individual narrators and the continuity ittisal of the isnad. In addition to locating hadith along this spectrum of authenticity, the question of the continuity of the isnad gave rise to its own separate set of categories, including mursal, munqati', mu'dal, and mudallas. Beyond these two primary factors, hadith critiques also take various other kinds of evidence into account that might shift the location of a given hadith along this spectrum. The second tier of hadith criticism examines the isnad and the matan concurrently and gives rise to categories such as shadh, anomalous, munkar, objectionable, muttarib, inconsistent, maqloob, reversed, mudraj, interpolated, musahaf, miswritten, and mu'allal, defective. These categories, all of which took matan criticism into account, also influenced determinations of authenticity and reliability. The schema developed by jurists for classifying hadith reports was based on a substantially different set of concerns. Jurists seek to locate hadith along a spectrum of authoritativeness, which ranges from certainty, qata', to probability, dhann. Their primary concern is thus not with isnad analysis, but rather with epistemological discussions, such as defining the conditions that must be met for a report to yield certainty and establishing the proper place of different kinds of hadith reports within a hierarchy of legal sources. Jurists thus include certain or include criteria in their evaluation of a hadith's authority that are external to the isnad itself, such as its reception history among the legal community. Their discipline also discuss the problem of contradictory proofs at length, establishing methods for reconciling conflicting evidence or prioritizing some types of evidence over others. The divergent concerns of these two scholarly communities are clearly reflected in their respective approaches to the issue of method criticism. Let's move now to the final section or final part of my talk, which is criteria for method criticism. In this section, I will list the main criteria of method criticism for each approach and then give examples. As for hadith critiques use of method criticism led them to identify several different categories of problematic hadiths. I have identified 5 categories here for the sake of convenience, and to a large extent they align with categories discussed in the mature genre of ulum al-hadith. However, we will see that within a single category, different terminology was used to refer to similar problems, especially in the formative period in which the terminology of hadith criticism was not yet standardized. These criteria are, number 1 is criticism of anomalous reports, التعليل بالتفرد, criticism of additions and interpolations, التعليل بالزيادة, criticism based on contradiction, التعليل بالمخالفة, criticism based on inconsistency, التعليل بالاختلاف, criticism based on errors, التعليل بالغلط. As for the criteria of jurists, they are contradicting reason, contradicting the Quran, contradicting the mashhur sunnah, contradicting consensus, ijma', solitary hadiths concerning issues of general concern, hadiths contradicting qiyas, and finally hadiths contradicting inherited tradition. So I will end up with just one example to save time, because I think we are late anyway. So this example is narrated by Ahmad ibn Hanbal that dismissed حديث شعبة عن أبي التياح قال سمعت أبا زرعة يحدث عن أبي هريرة عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه قال يهلك أمتي هذا الحي من قريش. قالوا فما تأمرنا يا رسول الله؟ قال لو أن الناس اعتزلوهم. So this tradition, so Ahmad ibn Hanbal dismissed a well-known hadith narrated via the isnad شعبة أبو التياح أبو زرعة أبو هريرة. The Prophet said, this branch of Quraysh will destroy my ummah. People said, what do you command us in that case, O Messenger of God? He said, if only people would stay away from them, I mean refrain from supporting them. This report was narrated by al-Bukhari and Muslim. Abdullah ibn Ahmad ibn Hanbal reported that his father, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, instructed that this hadith should be disregarded on his deathbed because it opposed other prophetic statements, such as the command to listen, obey, and be patient. Likewise, Abu Isma' wa Ata'. Likewise, Abu Bakr al-Marruzi said that Ibn Hanbal denigrated the hadith and noted that the Mu'tazilites used it as an excuse to abandon Friday prayers. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani also considered this hadith to be among the anomalous reports, غرائب of Shurba. So this is just an example to show, to prove or demonstrate one of the criteria that I mentioned, which is criticism of hadith reports, criticism of contradiction, criticism of hadith based on contradiction. So I think I took my 20 minutes. Did I? Okay, I will end up here and leave some time for the discussion, inshallah, and the questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, sir. It was a nice presentation. We have some questions, inshallah, we will have at the end. So now we will have our next speaker, Dr. Miraj Said, Assistant Professor at the Department of Religious Studies, University of California. He will be speaking on computational approaches in Hadith criticism. Let me cordially invite Professor, sir, please.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can you hear me?
Alaikum salam. Yes, sir, we could hear.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala sayyidil mursaleen wa ala alihi ashabi ajma'in. First of all, I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to join other esteemed colleagues. Thank you so much for that. And it's a wonderful experience speaking with the other panelists who have done wonderful work in this field and this discipline. And inshallah, my presentation will add some material to what they've already presented. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation. And then I'll begin from there. Can you see that?
Yes, sir, we could see.
Okay. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some aspects of research that I've been involved in for the past 4 years that tries to apply computational techniques to the study of Hadith literature. And it really tries to combine information that are found in two sources. And those two sources are, as we've already heard, the isnads that are found in collections of Hadith, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, all of the many books of Hadith, there are many of them. Anything that has an isnad that is attached to some kind of report that goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, that is one type of information. And then the second type of information is material found about biographies of narrators. Where did they live? When did they live? If we have that information, what is their genealogy? And of course, also judgments about how reliable of a transmitter they were, how trustworthy of a transmitter they were, how precise of a transmitter they were. Any kind of analysis that's done on Hadith usually combines some kind of information found in this type of work, also found in the isnads found in this type of work. And what I'm going to talk about are two basic types of analysis that are done either by Muslim scholars or by non-Muslim scholars, Western scholars, what I call a global type of analysis, and also a local type of analysis. So I'll begin by what I mean by a local type of analysis. The local type of analysis, it basically takes as its object a single hadith or a set of hadiths, and looks very closely at either the matan of the hadith, right? And they compare mutun of a particular hadith to maybe mutun of a better transmitted hadith or the Quran, and then, or they compare mutun to establish legal and theological ideas and make some kind of judgment about the matan. And we've seen, Professors Al-Khatib and Professor Isam give us examples of how that happens. The other type of criticism is isnad criticism, which is goes something like you look at an isnad of a hadith, you compile judgments on individual narrators, and if all of the narrators are trustworthy and precise, then you categorize that isnad as sahih or hasan or whatever. You make a judgment based on the cumulative evaluations of the individuals found in isnad. And you also have isnad and matan together. And the most prominent example that Dr. Al-Abbas talked about was isnad ka matan, which was popularized by Matsky. But we also see isnad ka matan also in, I think, Professor Khatib talked about Bukhari and Muslim, effectively that they did some type of isnad ka matan. They identified ziyadat, they compared the text along with the isnads to make some kind of judgments about, okay, yeah, I'm going to include this in my sahih, I'm not going to include this in my sahih. Now, the interesting thing is this: these are very, very microscopic or local type of analysis. So you take a hadith, a collection of hadith, you combine information in the narrator, in the biographical dictionaries, the narrator criticism sources, and also the isnads, and you make some kind of judgments. Now, people like Goldziher and Schacht, what they have done is they have taken these local judgments based on a small data set and tried to say something globally about hadith literature as a whole. So Goldziher was quite dismissive of isnads because many of the hadith that he found, the content of them you could obviously see it was created for an ideological reason that occurred in much later on in Umayyad or Abbasid society. For instance, the hadith that condemns the people that regard the Quran as created, or that asserts that the Quran is uncreated. Obviously, that is a theological controversy that emerges later on in Muslim society, and the hadith is fabricated. So he takes those examples and then he introduces a global skepticism of all isnads, or a global skepticism of all hadith literature. Schacht does the same thing based on a few legal hadiths in which he notices back growth. He says all hadith in the early part of isnads must be fabrications, and the common link is the real creator of the hadith, right? And I think that something similar might also be going on when within Sunnism, 6 particular books emerged as the Sahih Sitta. That's a global judgment of the authoritativeness of all of the hadith in these sources based on certain local judgments of the addition of the accumulation of certain local judgments on particular and specific hadiths. So this is what I mean by a local analysis. Now, a global analysis is something that relies on information that is largely found in the biographical dictionaries. So the anecdotes, like how can we start, like you go through and your question is, I want to provide a history of the development of writing versus oral transmission in hadith literature. I want to provide a global history of how hadith literature emerged and changed over time. One of the ways to do that is you go and you look at the anecdotes that are found about hadith transmission practices of different narrators. So when did the writing of hadith system begin systematically? We can make that judgment when we collate all of the anecdotes found about written versus oral transmission, and then we create a chronological framework of how that developed over time. Another way to do is by organizing the material found in the biographical sources to create some kind of data. So for instance, I want to know how many hadith transmitters there are in Baghdad in a particular time period. I go through the biographical dictionaries. I look at the time, the year in which people died, year in which they were born, if that's available, and the city in which they were supposed to have lived. And I gather all of that information together and I create a table, I create a graph, and then I organize the data in some kind of way. And then the objective is to say something about the nature of hadith transmission and how it changed over time. And this is a global analysis. Note, this global analysis relies largely only on information that are found in the biographical sources and not on information that are found in the isnads that make up the collections of the hadith itself. However, so each of these approaches, the global approaches and the local approaches, has its own strengths and weaknesses. So the strength of the local approach is that it's very detail oriented and looks at a very small set of hadiths and makes a judgment about those texts in some way or another. The weakness of that is, well, you can't make substantiated global claims based on a very small data set, because the object of your analysis is very specific and particular and small. You can't necessarily extend that to say something about hadith literature as a whole, right? And similarly, global analysis has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. The strengths of the global analysis is that it does not infer from a small sample to big conclusions. It looks at information scattered across many biographies, thousands maybe even. But its weaknesses is it completely ignores the data and information that's quite voluminous found in the isnads. And what we try to do is we're trying to do a global analysis, and by we, I'm talking about our team of researchers, a global analysis that combines both the biographical information with the isnad data. And in order to do that, you really need to rely on some kind of computation. You need to rely on computers. And in order to rely on computers, you need to rely on a source that has digitized the information that are found in the biographical dictionaries and the information that are found in the collections of hadith. And the one particular source that has done this really well is this source called Jawami al-Kalam, which is available as a program that you download and install on your desktop. And this data set, the Jawami al-Kalam data set, they have digitized about 447,205 hadiths drawn from 1,348 different books. And they have scrutinized and digitized the information and created about 600 information in these 447,000 hadiths. They found 638,237 isnads. The reason why there's a discrepancy between hadiths and isnads is because a single hadith might be narrated by 2, 3, 4, many isnads. And that's why there's a discrepancy between the two. And what they also did is they went through all of these 638,237 isnads, and they found that it contains 49,819 unique narrators. Now, the real contribution of this data set is that they have linked the transmitters in the isnads to their corresponding biographies. This is a huge undertaking, and this is really a step forward. And let me show you exactly what I mean. So here is an example of a screenshot from Jawami al-Kalam. So you can see this hadith is Buni al-Islam ala khamsatin. No, it's not. It's something else. But the most important point is you can see that the names that make up the isnads are in red. The matan is in green. There's the names that make up the isnads. Now, if you click on these names, you can bring each of these names. You can bring up biographical information. So, for instance, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, he's one of the narrators of this hadith, and you can get basic biographical information about him. He was born in the year 50. He died in the year 96. He lived in the year or had residence in the city of Kufa, right? And you have all kinds of other information as well. So you can already see that they have, in effect, combined the information found in isnads with the information found in biographical dictionaries, right? And in this program, you can also get a visual depiction of what an isnad looks like, right? So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud transmitted to Alqama, who transmitted to Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, all the way down until it was recorded in Sahih al-Bukhari, right? Now, there are limitations to this program, and I'm going to talk about how we overcame those limitations to effectively create our own data set and our own structure to answer the types of questions that we were interested in answering. You can actually take the isnads, right, of different hadiths together, and Dr. Al-Abbas talked about this. So, for instance, let's say you have this isnad that's found in this hadith A, B, C. You know, obviously, hadiths can be narrated through the exact same isnad, different hadiths. So let's say you have another one, A, B, C, but you have A, D, C here, hadith number 3. You can create a network of all these people were in some way related to each other, despite the fact that they participated in different isnads and different hadiths. Now you can create an entire social network from all 49,000 narrators mentioned in all 638,000 isnads and create a huge social network that consisted of about 4 million transmissions between all of these narrators, making up this huge social network, right? And the social network is so large and so dense and lasted such a long time that if you were try to draw it out on a screen like this, it looks like a big, messy ball. And in fact, it is very hard for a computer to process all of that information and display it visually. So, but once you do this, once you create a social network like this, you can do a lot of very interesting things. You can apply what are called node prominence measures. So node prominence measures are basically mathematical models used by these big tech firms like Facebook and Twitter that tell you, based on the nature of the relationships between these narrators, who is the most important, who is the most prominent, who is the one that maybe not the most important, but served as a gateway between different communities. You can do other things like community detection, all based on just the relationships between narrators or the relationships between different nodes. The other thing is that what you can do is you can add information like city information and year information to these nodes, okay? And you can effectively start creating how many hadith are being narrated in Kufa. How are hadith traveling in different years and different time periods? Kufa to Basra, Kufa to Baghdad, Baghdad to Damascus. Like, what is the nature of the transmission activity in a given city and what is the nature of the flow of hadith transmission in different time periods between cities as well. And what one small part of our research tried to calculate based on combining the information in cities and combining the information of when people died together to calculate in each city what was the volume of hadith transmission activity in a particular time period. So this is the type of global analysis that combines information found in biographies with information found in the isnads in order to make a global conclusion, like what are the most important cities for hadith transmission in different time periods based on global information, right? So in order to do this, though, we had to come up with a way is how do we assign transmissions to a city and time, right? I'm going to show you some of the assumptions that we made in order to do these types of calculations. Because we need to put transmissions, and a transmission is defined as one narrator transmitting to another narrator found in an isnad. That narrator usually has some kind of information about when he died. That narrator has some kind of information about where he lived. Like that is a transmission. That's how we define that transmission. And that transmission can occur in multiple hadiths and multiple isnads, right? So, and we've seen that a transmitter relationship can occur. We've seen this in many isnads and many different hadiths. But we need to put transmissions in years and put transmissions in cities based on where the narrators were. So how do we do that? So in our hadith network, we have 119,730 unique transmissions or unique teacher-student relationships. And they represent 593 unique cities. And this hadith network lasts between -11 to 872 Hijri. And we wanted to take each transmission in an isnad and assign it to both a city and a year. So how do we do that? Let's take the example of this. Ishaq ibn Mansur claims Israel ibn Yunus as his source, as his teacher. And this transmission, Ishaq ibn Mansur from Israel ibn Yunus, occurs in 44 hadiths, right? Here's the data that we have. We know that Israel was born in 100 and died in 160. And we know that Ishaq died in the year 200. We don't know when Ishaq was born. Jawam al-Kalam says that Israel was in Baghdad and Kufa, and Ishaq was only in Kufa, right? So we need a method for assigning a city and year for these 44 transmissions or 44 hadiths for this relationship. So this is what we did. So here's Israel ibn Yunus, born in the year 100, died in the year 160. And Ishaq ibn Mansur dies in the year 204. The assumption that we make is here's the overlap between the life of these two individuals. We assume that the 44 hadiths between Israel and Ishaq probably may have occurred any time in the last 20 years of Israel ibn Yunus's life, from the year 141 to the year 160. And we say there's a 5% chance that each one of these years, these 44 hadiths were being narrated. So basically, we introduced some kind of probability calculation into the mix, right? So for each year, there's a 5% chance these 44 hadiths were narrated. If you multiply that by the 44 hadiths, you basically place 2.2 hadiths for each year from 141 all the way to 160, right? And then, okay, so that solves the problem of year. How do we solve the problem of city? So we know Israel was in Baghdad and Kufa. We know Ishaq was in Kufa. We say all 44 hadiths from the years 144 to 160 are in the city that's shared between these two individuals, which is in Kufa. So we assign all 44 hadiths, 2.2 hadiths per year, 141 to 160 in the city of Kufa, right? That's how we placed those transmissions there. So something like for every single relationship, we have the number of hadiths assigned to the city and assigned to the year. Now, we did this for all 193,000 relationships across 593 cities, across 800 years, right? And then when you do all of that, when you create and structure the data in this way, you can calculate and calculate the volume of hadith transmission in each city in the different years over time, right? So what does it look like? Here's what it looks like. This is from the year 12 to the year 400, 593 cities. There were 945,363 instances of transmission. And this is Medina right here. The green and the yellow is Kufa and Basra. This blue right here, you can see, is Baghdad. You can see Baghdad's dominance in the later time period, right? Let's take a closer look. This is kind of a confusing picture. Let's take a closer look at just the 4 top cities. Here's the data in a different format called the Hadith Map. You can kind of see the 4 top cities. The darker the color, the more intense the volume of hadith activity is. You can see how Medina is very intense, and then it goes and it fades and disappears. Kufa has a growing intensity. Kufa and Basra are simultaneously have very high hadith transmission in this time period. And then as Baghdad emerges, Baghdad becomes dominant. So we have a very precise way of saying that Medina is the original city where hadith is most transmitted, then Kufa, then Basra, then Baghdad. I want to show you, you can kind of say that Medinan Dominance, so Medina is red, is in the first phase from the year 12 to the year 116. Then we have a second phase. So here you can see Medina is very dominant. You have a second phase where the green and the yellow is Basra. Kufa and Basra are the dominant in the year 117 to 188, right here. And then you have a third phase where Basra is dominant and Baghdad emerges, right here. And then you have Baghdadi dominance from 253 to 400, right here, the blue. And we can also correlate this progression with context. Why Medina in phase 1? Medina remains the residence for the Hijazi elite well into the middle of the 2nd century. Many of the Prophet's young companions who are prolific narrators remain there. And Medina becomes the seat of scholarly activities in the second half of the 1st century. Why Kufa and Basra? Kufa and Basra quickly surpassed Medina in population. We know that. And then with the Abbasid revolution in 132, Kufa becomes the court of the capital until Baghdad is founded in 145. Why Basra in this phase? When Baghdad gets founded, it takes all of the energy from central Iraq, from Kufa. And then Basra emerges as the port for the Indian Ocean trade through Baghdad. And then in the latter half, it declines because of political unrest and the population declines. And then why Baghdad from 253 to 400? Baghdad eventually displaces Basra's relationships between the Iranian aristocracy And Baghdad is just the dominant city in the Middle East. So what we have is a correlation between
Sir,
yes.
Could we wind up here as we are running late?
Yes. This is my last slide. I'm very sorry.
Okay,
what you have here is correlation of the rise and fall of Hadith transmission activity with other economic and political actors, political factors. And that kind of proves that a global skepticism of isnads, Goldzier and Schacht, is incorrect. That's the presentation. I'm very sorry for going over. Let me stop my screen sharing.
Okay, thank you, sir. It was a nice presentation. And I think the topic would be somewhat new for many researchers in this Hadith, those who do research in Hadith studies. Hope they would get much, they would benefit much from your presentation. Now we will have some questions, and I hope our presenters would give answers. Although we have a couple of questions due to our limited time, I am just reading few among them only, and hope our speakers would answer accordingly. We'll have other question. I think Professor Murtaza Khatib, Ustad Murtaz, could answer this question. Ustad, are you here?
Oh, yes, I'm here.
Okay. The question is, how can we justify the authenticity of oral transmission before Umar bin Abdul Aziz to a liberal community?
To what? Sorry, to what?
Okay.
Before
how can we? Yes, sir.
Before Umar bin Abdul Aziz to which community?
To a liberal community.
Okay. So I think the question of the authenticity of the oral transmissions is a critical question to in the Western scholarship, but not in the classical Islamic scholarship. As far as we rely on the oral transmissions and we rely on the isnad matn criticism, and because in principle the transmission of prophetic, the majority of the prophetic sunnah was it was transmitted orally. So the question is not about the tool that it was transmitted through, but the question is about the conditions and the criteria they were proved to be accepted or to be considered as authentic or not authentic, unauthentic. So this is my answer. So the question itself, in principle, is not. It depends on the authority or the reference that you are relying on. Within the classical time, or based on the classical methodology, it's not a legitimate question. But if you are going to rely on the doubt surrounding on if you are going to give the preference to the written transmitted works, then okay, it's a big question.
Okay, sir. We have also, it's somewhat lengthy. Let me read. Okay, just a while. Let me read from chat box. Okay, the question is, Sharia brings all human activities within 5 hukum. For justifying the religious ahkam of fiqh, only hadiths of certain degrees are accepted and some are not considered, just like da'if. But they are included in some disciplines like studies which teach us good character, ilm al-akhlaq. Here, when all moral actions are considered by fiqh, why are these Da'if ahadith not completely excluded from all the disciplines that are related to the religion?
Okay. So I think that the question of the authenticity of the Da'if Hadith is ambiguous, and it's a critical point based on the classical different opinions. But as relying on Da'if Hadith based on the judgment of whom, you know. So now, if you are going to rely on, for example, the contemporary scholar like Al-Albani, that who considered such hadith as da'if, so it's not necessary to be considered as da'if, you know, a weak hadith. But if you are referring to the judgments made by hadith critics in the classical time, in the very early period, then they differentiated between hukum and rulings and juristic rulings, hukum fiqhi and ethics based on in the sense of the classical time, that ethics refers, in that time ethics was referred to the personal treaties, personal traits, you know, and the character of the personality. It was not referring to what we consider now as ethics in the contemporary time as a normative, because ethics in the classical time was meant to be referring to characteristic, the personal characteristics or traits. So it was a descriptive, not a normative. So the normative authority was given to, in the classical time, was given to only the, in principle, to the Sahih Hadith, you know, the authentic Hadith. But it doesn't mean that, you know, Hadith Da'if, the weak Hadith, was not considered as an authority, because we know that many scholars, even in the very early period in the juristic schools, they relied on some Hadith Da'if, like Hadith al-Mursal, for example. It was considered as Hujjah in Al-Shafi'i, even in the Shafi'i school. And in the Hanafi school, you know. So it depends on what type of da'if are you talking about. So because we have a spectrum of hadith da'if, weak hadith. So, but in principle, the hadith da'if was even considered as reliable or as a source of evidence in the fiqh schools in the very early period.
Okay, sir.
So the final point that I can mention here, why do we have this differentiation that was narrated to Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Abdurrahman Mahdi and some other scholars, those who were said that إذا روينا في الأحكام تشددنا وإذا روينا في الفضائل الأعمال تساهلنا. So they were considering that, you know, what they considered as a category of ethics is a matter of referring to the good actions, good traits, and good characters or good actions, that in the sense that it was not relied only on this single evidence or independent evidence. So in this case, they refer to the weak hadith as a matter of, in my opinion, as a matter of a human tradition out of the juristic rulings. This can explain, you know, the works of Ibn Abi Dunya and the works of other muhaddithin, traditionists, those who mainly narrated weak hadiths when they compiled their works on what we consider now as ethical works.
Fine. So shall we move to our next question? I think this question can be answered by Professor Isam Edo. Sir, are you here?
Yeah.
Okay, the question is the Murtazilite methodology of Hadith criticism based on mere theological perspective, or is there any influence of historical events?
Yeah, the short answer is there is an influence of historical events in both of theological and epistemological perspectives of Mu'tazilite.
Okay, sir. Another question is, how can we rationally prevent Mu'tazila concerns to reject Khabar al-Wahid as there is no corroborating isnas?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Okay. How can we rationally prevent Murtazila concerns to reject Khabar al-Wahid as there is no corroborating isnas?
So the question is not clear. So I did not get the question clearly. So that's how we prevent Mu'tazila?
Rationally.
Yeah. So from rejecting Khabar al-Wahid?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not about rational. So it's the question here. So we don't need to apply in terms of criticizing Mu'tazilite approach based on the methodology of Ahl al-Hadith or the methodology of Isa bin Aban or al-Karhi or all of these figures in the early period of Islam. So the criticism, in my opinion, coming from the epistemology of testimony. So Mu'tazila here, it seems for me, just applied a reductionist methodology. So they are reductionist and they don't rely on hadith as an independent evidence for or giving any authority. So I think so we need just to elevate and to transcend the discussion between Mu'tazilites and other schools in Sunni thought and other theological thoughts to the epistemology of testimony. And this is what I'm working right now is how we can work on the epistemology of testimony and reshape the discipline and how we can come to this field from a different angle. So this like it's not easy to address this question here right now. It seems like needs another discussion, and because there are many technical terms, there is a background. But however, there is a paper coming out very soon on Sahih al-Bukhari and the epistemology of testimony. This a new shift I'm working on, and hope it can help the field.
Okay, thank you, sir. It would be better if we have that one. Okay, thank you, sir. Then we have one more question. I think Professor Miraj Said could answer this question. So are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So the question is, doesn't the probability assuming in computational approaches result in inaccurate understanding of hadith?
So I think the question is expressing concern about introducing probability, and that might distort a proper understanding of hadith. Like if you introduce that's my understanding of the question. So, and I think that, I think that in a lot of ways, what this work does is it makes concrete what is already implicit in many of the usuli type of discussions about hadith's authenticity and authority that Dr. Al-Khatib went over. Like the usulis said, hadith are either, dhanni, probabilistic, or yaqeen, based on ahad or mutawatir, based on the number of chains, for instance, that transmitted the content of that hadith over time. So this is like an analytical category that's already there in the usul al-fiqh. Now, what our work does is it takes that broad philosophical category and it translates that into more precise numbers based on the quantitative features that are present in the isnads, which is thousands of names, thousands of isnads in this huge corpus of literature combined with the biographical information. So I tell my team, it's similar to what Galileo did in the history of physics. So physics before Galileo was kind of a philosophical and conceptual field. What he did was he came in and made it more precise and particular and specific by introducing mathematics and calculus in order to explain motion in a much more precise way. And I feel like maybe what we're trying to do is translate these categories, yaqeen and probabilism, into something like 50%, 75%, and trying to do that in a justifiable way, in a way that makes sense. So I think that our work is an extension of the logic that's already implicit in the usul tradition. It just takes that logic and gives it a concrete expression based on these new techniques. Now, we've always been, I think that maybe there might be some anxiety over the lack of certainty. And I think that we have to learn how to get reused to this idea of probability, because in the past, we were always able to function as a religious community with probability. It's the reason why we have 4 schools and not 1. It's the reason why much of our fiqh is probabilistic in nature, and it's acknowledged as probabilistic in nature. It's the reason why we are very tolerant of differences of opinion. It's because on a lot of issues, we are just not able to justify a certain belief. And so I don't think that there's anything wrong with accepting that the Prophet probably said this and acting on it. And I don't think that, the work that we're doing is just trying to go take that idea and extend it and to give it some kind of concrete form. Let's see if it works or if it doesn't work. And it's a very experimental research. Let's see if it works or it doesn't work. I don't know.
Okay, so I think so. The question.
This is a very critical point, Malaj, because modernity is not tolerant with any, diversity, because it seeks for just the only true. And
yes,
real.
I know. Yeah. And I think it's the legacy of Christianity on the Enlightenment, because the Christian church was not able to deal with uncertainty, not the way that we were. And that legacy seeped into Enlightenment thinking, and they were also not able to, despite the fact that they advertised themselves as tolerant, pluralistic, and all of that. Reality is, in practice, I don't think that's true. And I think that, unfortunately, we have kind of taken on some of those intellectual characteristics and social characteristics, and we want everything to be black and white. And in the past, we were like, okay, some things are black and white, core fundamental things are black and white, most things are gray, and we're okay with that. And on the day of judgment, Allah will tell us who's right and who's wrong. Wallahu a'lam,
Interestingly, that it was applicable for even the legal system, and the law of the state now is not open to any other diversity, So yes. Only just one.
Yeah.
One.
Alhamdulillah. This final webinar was great success. It was a wonderful session so far. There have been fruitful discussions and talks. Even our Q&A session got changed into a panel discussion. It's indeed a great privilege to thank everyone for making this webinar fruitful and constructive. The webinar has shed light to various methodologies used by scholars within Muslim classical scholarship and Western Orientalist tradition. I hope that this webinar will open up a path for the bright future for us in Hadith studies and will pave the way to new heights as it was. We would like to, on behalf of Jamia Markaz and Jamia Madinatun and the entire team Riwaya, extend a very hearty thanks to all speakers and audience for being here with us. Especially a big thank you to Dr. M.H. Azhari Al-Kandi, Director Jamia Madinatun, for taking time from his busy schedule to join with us. Also, we must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Dr. Isam Ada for his exceptional talk here. Thank you, sir. And further, we are grateful to Dr. Maharaj Said for his excellent presentation on the topic. Thank you, sir. We may also like to express our sincere thanks to Dr. Murtaza Khatib for giving excellent coverage to his topic. Thank you, sir. We also wish to express my gratitude to Dr. Bilal Abbas for providing an encouraging topic on his topic. We are all inspired by your great words. A big thank you to all of you once again, and we hope all your supports to our future endeavors. And let me conclude. That's only from me. Have a nice day. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.